Hello everyone. I want to start off this video with a question. What makes for a good poem? Or even, what makes a poem? In modern English, there isn't a simple answer to those questions. A poem can rhyme, or it can't. A poem might use elevated literary language, or it might not. A poem can be written about more or less anything and convey any emotions the poet wants. It's even possible to build a found poem out of phrases taken from other sources, like comedian Dave Gorman in his TV series Modern Life is Goodish. It's possible to write these sorts of free poems in Japanese too nowadays, but you're probably more familiar with the 17-syllable haiku with its requirement for a seasonal keyword. If a haiku doesn't have one of these, then some critics would say it's not a haiku at all, as it's not following the rules. Other critics might just say such a poem was a bad haiku. You might get a similar response if a poem mentioned snow but was set in summer, as the seasons don't match. If we wind the clock back even further, to the late 12th century, then questions about what made poems good were of vital importance to many of the aristocrats living in the capital, Miyako, modern Kyoto. Reputations could be made or destroyed by the assessments of one's poems, and poetry matches, uta awase, were a regular feature of aristocratic life. Famous poets were like rock stars, liable to be approached in public by people asking for their comments on poems they had written. The famous and irascible poet Fujiwara no Teika wrote in his diary, in Robert Huey's translation, that lady fools dumped their worthless poems on us. People stared at us as though we were a show, when he and some of his friends attempted to have a cherry blossom party at the Imperial Palace in 1203. The poems that Teika and the other aristocrats were writing were Waka, which have 31 syllables in a 5-7-5-7-7 pattern. There were a lot of rules about Waka. They had to be on set and approved topics. They had to use language which was poetic. They had to express appropriate emotions, and so forth. Different poets disagreed, though, about what made for proper topics, what appropriate emotions were, and what language was poetic. These disagreements often played out in the comments, critiques and judgments which arose in poetry matches, with the pronouncements of matches judges helping to define what made for good composition and what didn't. What I'm going to talk about in this video is one question which poets disagreed about: whether or not you could use material of Sinitic, Chinese, origin to compose Waka, or to build a case for whether a Waka was any good. This might seem quite niche and technical, and in one sense it is, but one of the big questions in Japanese studies has long been how Japan has related to China. The quotation marks there are deliberate because for much of history the relationship has been between what we could crudely call cultural concepts rather than nations in the modern sense. Given the centrality of poetry to political, cultural and social life in pre-modern Japan, and especially while Kyoto was the locus of political power, understanding what poets' attitudes were to Sinitic material sheds light on contemporaneous attitudes to China generally, and thus contributes to our understanding of the important question of the relationship between Japan and China. This is a question which scholars, both Japanese and not, have long thought about and have come up with a range of different theories on. Going into all the ins and outs of this would take far too long for this video, but I'll try to give you a brief summary. Briefly, one early school of thought saw Japan's contact with China as the uncritical adoption of the latter by the former, leading to a distinctive Japanese culture being overwhelmed by the more advanced one from China. It's certainly true that Japan adopted a lot from China. Models of government, a writing system, religion, philosophy, medicine, literature, an educational curriculum. The list just goes on, so it's relatively easy to understand why the theory of Japan being overwhelmed developed. But is that really the case? Well, other scholars have challenged this narrative in various ways. Yes, Japan took a lot from China, but there was also a lot which it didn't, which suggests discrimination on the part of the Japanese. They took what they wanted and found useful, and ignored what they didn't. There's also the question of how useful concepts like Japan and China are in this historical context. Some scholars have argued that these are entirely modern constructions, and the people of the time simply viewed all aspects of culture as being equivalent. If this is the case, then when the Japanese took something from China, they weren't taking something foreign, only something missing from their own context. But is that true? There's no doubt that the language of civilization and culture throughout much of Asia was literally Sinitic, or Classical Chinese to give it a more common name. No one actually spoke this language, even in China, but anyone with an education could read it, and that includes in Japan, so it was a badge, or maybe a pass might be a better term, granting access to a common body of knowledge and membership of a common cultural elite. There were many texts written in literary Sinitic in Japan. This continued more or less right up to 1945, but what's interesting is that a way of reading them developed called kundoku. This involved adding various diacritics to a literary Sinitic text to show how it would be read if it were Japanese. When the text was read then, it would be read as if it were Japanese, making the act of reading a form of on-the-fly translation. What this means is that, in contrast to those who have argued that writing and reading in literary Sinitic was just something that people did, and they thought no more of it than we might if we switched fonts suddenly in a text, others have argued that writers would have been consciously aware of the difference. Switching meant something, although of course it's difficult for us to know exactly what. What we can probably say with some confidence, though, is that pre-modern Japanese writers didn't see using literary Sinitic as them using something foreign, just something different and with a specific purpose in mind. So there was an awareness that Sinitic material was different from Japanese, and that each had a sphere to which it was more suited. To some extent, this reflects the reality on the ground. My colleague Giampiero Piaciani points out in his recent book, Poets, Patrons and the Public, that writing in literary Sinitic was a closely guarded prerogative of specific groups at the early Japanese court. It certainly wasn't something that anyone and everyone was allowed to do, meaning that there was a clear awareness of difference and individuals with an interest in making sure that awareness was maintained. I hope that's given you an idea of the debate that has gone on in English language scholarship at least. Narrowing the focus a bit, what about poetry? Waka. Well, again, there's no doubt that poetry in Japan was subject to extensive Chinese influence. Even as far back as the 8th century, there's evidence that some of the poems in Manyoshu, Japan's earliest anthology, were composed with awareness of Sinitic seasonal tropes. It's also the case that the earliest ideas about poetics were imported from China, along with any number of images, emotions and other elements. But did this mean that it was a free-for-all in Waka composition? Could a poet just use any Sinitic element they liked when composing a Waka? And if they did, what did critics make of this? Well, we actually have some concrete evidence of this from the poetry contest in 600 rounds, Ropyakuban Uta Awase, which took place in 1193-94. For this event, Fujiwara no Yoshitsune, the son of the then regent and thus one of the most important young men at court, devised a list of 100 poetic topics and asked 11 other poets to compose 100 poems, one on each of the topics. With his own 100 poems included, that made for 1,200 poems in all, which he divided into 600 rounds, often placing poems by more conservative older poets against those of younger, more innovative ones. The poems were recited aloud, a process which took several months given the number of rounds, and after each pair of poems, the poets in attendance, we know from contemporaneous sources that not everyone was there every day, weighed in with their comments, criticisms and questions on the opposing team's poems. Notes of these discussions were made, and both poems and notes were sent in batches to Fujiwara no Shunzei, the most highly respected poet of the time and probably Japan's greatest pre-modern critic, to render judgment and decide whether rounds had a winner and loser, or if they tied, either because both poems were excellent or both had faults. Some of the topics Yoshitsune chose for the contest, love and pleasure girls and love and merchants, for example, echoed topics used in Sinitic poetry and were thus an explicit attempt to generate poems drawing on Sinitic tropes. But most of the poets in the contest produced a poem or two drawing on Sinitic material in some way or another, ranging from referring to stories from Chinese sources, echoing Sinitic phrasing, or using tropes which were part of Sinitic poetry. Sometimes they also explicitly referred to Sinitic material when defending their poems against criticism. In his judgments, Shunzei is assiduous in identifying Sinitic references in the contest's poems. He also draws upon Sinitic material to support the conclusions he reaches about poems' quality. He isn't the only one to do this. One of the poets in the contest, Kensho, was so incensed by Shunzei's criticisms of his poems that he wrote a lengthy appeal, Chinjo, to Yoshitsune, arguing that Shunzei was wrong. He too draws on Sinitic material in support of his case in places. So, what does Shunzei think about poems using Sinitic material? The simple answer is not much. In particular, he is strongly against poems which use language which has a Sinitic flavour. For example, on the topic of the view over Hirasawa Pond, this was and is a body of water lying to the north of the capital which was famous as a moon viewing spot. It's not much changed today from how it looked back then, so you can go and see it for yourself if you're ever in the area. Fujiwara no Takanobu's poem is Tsuki no sumu soro wa yoso ni mo kawaraji yo. Manako ni amaru Hirasawa no kage. The moon so clearly lodged within the skies distant yet unchanging. The sight can never sate my eyes, light on Hirasawa. Shunzei disapproves of this poem's expression, saying it is reminiscent of expressions like all four corners of the world laid out before my gaze, which, when one hears them in Chinese poetry, are remarkable, but sound wrong in a Japanese poem and are even incomprehensible. He's referring here to a line from a well-known Sinitic poem. So this is a pretty clear statement that he feels that language which is too redolent of Sinitic doesn't match the proper aesthetic for Waka. He also doesn't approve of poems which draw on Sinitic sources which don't fit the emotional tone of the Waka's topic. For example, this is a poem from the match on the topic of love and mountains. Kono yo ni wa Yoshino no yama nyo, oku ni dani ari to watsuraki hito ni shirareji. Within this world were I, in the Yoshino mountains, heart even so, that cruel one would know it not. The poem alludes, quite subtly I have to say, to the Chinese tale of the white-headed recluses of Mount Shang. These were four officials who retired to Mount Shang in protest at despotic rule at the end of the Qin dynasty around 210 BCE. Shunzei states that the poem is overly pretentious and continues that it is extremely difficult in the end to make these sentiments relevant to our land. Even where the emotions in the Sinitic source fit the topic, he still disapproves if the allusion is too obscure. Kensho's poem on the topic of love and paintings alludes to the story of the Chinese painter Chang Kang, Gu Kaiji, who was able to meet a woman after he painted a portrait of her. Itowarete mune yasukaranu omoi wa hito no ue ni zo kakiuchi tsuru. Being despised and my unquiet heart filled with feelings, upon her I paint them out. When the poem was recited, none of the other poets understood this allusion, and Kensho had to explain it. But even so, in his judgment, Shunzei says that he is still unclear about what the poem means, having no recollection of a person named in this Chinese manner. He clearly feels that allusions in Waka composition should be transparent enough to be easily understood, and that the potential obscurity of Sinitic references makes them problematic. This outrages Kensho, who fulminates in his appeal that one should not compose based upon sources of which people are not normally aware is the substance of Shunzei's ideas. After all, when one starts to read such a source, although it is relatively obscure having read it, would the majority of folk not understand? So, if Sinitic language was out and allusions were equivocal at best, what about using Sinitic material as evidence for criticism? Well, the answer here too is equivocal. Shunzei certainly draws upon this in some of his judgments. For example, on the topic of love and the sea, Kensho's poem is Kujira toru sakashiki yumi no sokomade mo kimi da ni sumaba namiji shinogan. The whale-hunting, savage sea's depths, even there, should it be your dwelling, would I endure the waves. Shunzei strongly disapproves of this poem, calling it extremely fearsome. and remarking that when Emperor Qin Shi Huang sought Mount Penglai, although he said to shoot great fish, I have not heard he went so far as to hunt them, thus drawing on Sinitic material as supporting evidence. Kenshaw disagrees, calling this judgment bizarre in his appeal, and continuing that whale hunting does not occur in the three histories or the selections of refined literature is a matter of no importance for the poetry of Yamato. With that being said, Kenshaw feels able to draw on Sinitic evidence too. Elsewhere, he draws upon Sinitic sources as evidence that a term he has used refers to a yellow chrysanthemum, after Shunzei says in his judgment that there isn't any definite proof for this. As a final piece to this puzzle, there's also the question of whether Sinitic poetics, rules for composition, were a valid basis for constructing or criticising Waka. Shunzei is quite clear that they are not. For example, there is Tozakaru hito no kokoro wa unabara no okiyuku funa no ato no shiokaze. Ever more distant grows his heart, into the seaplanes of the offing goes a boat, wake touched by the tide winds. As I'm sure you can see, the Japanese version of this poem contains 4 uses of the word no, and excessive repetition of identical elements was regarded as a fault in Sinitic poetics. This rule was adopted in Japan, and the opposing team state plainly, there are too many uses of no. Shunzei disagrees, saying, in today's poetry there are countless poems in which these faults can be identified, and going on to remark ironically that a gentleman of the right, being so well read in Chinese scholarship, has required revisions to the faulty poem of the left in the absence of the judge, taking the right to task for their presumption. This was a theme he was to return to in later writing, where he says that one would end up discounting all of the good poems from ancient times if you attempted to apply these sorts of rules to Waka. So, to return to the question which I posed at the beginning of this video, what makes for a good poem? Well, I think it's clear from this that first and most importantly, for a Waka to be good, it had to avoid language with a Sinitic flavour. Shunzei definitely feels that the language of Waka and of Kanshi, Sinitic poetry, was different and not suited to each other. He's not saying that one is better than the other, just that they were different. Second, Sinitic poetic compositional rules were inappropriate for critiquing Waka. He's clearly of the opinion that the linguistic differences between Japanese and Sinitic mean that rules based on the latter are pointless for the former. Third, allusions to Sinitic sources could be made in Waka as long as they were sources which both fit with the emotional tone of the assigned topic and were sufficiently well known to be easily understood. This fits, I think, with 2 of the general criteria for judging Waka in poetry matches, which were that they should adhere to the topic and also be sufficiently easy to understand that their meanings could be understood when the poem was recited. Finally, evidence from Sinitic sources could be used to make critical points. In that sense, it was a resource just like material from Japanese ones. However, that evidence might not be accepted and could be challenged. What does this tell us about Japanese attitudes to China in the early medieval period? Well, in the field of Waka at any rate, there was a keen awareness of difference between the two, and that it was better for them to stay in their own lane, one might say. I hope you found this short discussion interesting. If you want to know more, then you'll be pleased to know that I've had an article published on this very topic entitled Confusion over Cathay, Attitudes to Chinese Material in Medieval Japanese Poetic Criticism, where I go into these issues in more detail than I can here. It's open access, so anyone can read it. You can find the link below, so if you're interested, please do take a look. As always, please do like and share this video if you feel it will be useful, and post any questions in the comments. See you next time.